Okay, we should be live on YouTube now. Just take another moment to let everybody into the room here. Okay, welcome everybody. It's the top of the hour. It's a happy Friday. Thanks for joining us here on CCTV and the CCTV YouTube channel, where we do a webinar roughly every 3 weeks or 3 out of every 4 weeks at Conservatory Canada. I'm the Executive Director, Derek Auger, recognizing a lot of the names here in the participants column today, but also a lot of new names. I know you're probably interested in our topic today, and I think you'll really enjoy this presentation by Dr. Erin Parks. Just a little bit of background first in terms of where we're heading with the webinar over the next couple of weeks. Next week, I'll give you another look at the grade 3 repertoire. And I'll just hold up the book here, grade 3 mosaics. We hope that this is going to be available around November 8th is the indication I'm getting today. You'd be able to start ordering that for those of you that are curious about it. And I'm going to play through or start to play through that repertoire for you next Friday. Last Friday, if you want to watch the replays on the YouTube channel, I read through the prep book for you with all the pieces. And next Friday, we'll do just the group 1 repertoire from grade 3. And then the week after that, we're going to take a week off. And then on Friday, the 15th, I believe it is, of November, I'll read through some more of grade 3. And then on November 22nd, we're going to have Olivia Riddell here from Music for Young Children, who's going to put on an NYC webinar for us on that Friday. So that's a little bit about where we're going. Keep an eye on your inboxes, of course, as usual, for the links to register. If you want to join us live in the Zoom room, you can ask questions. And for today's session, I ask that you put all of your serious questions as we go along in the Q&A box. And we'll stop at the end for a longer Q&A session at the end with Erin, where she's going to answer your questions there. If you have just any general comments or chatter, go ahead and throw that in the chat box and I'll moderate those a little bit. But all of your serious questions, please go in the Q&A today, because I imagine we're going to have a lot of things here as we talk about teaching and working with neurodivergent students. And if there ever was an expert, and in terms of helping us deal with our studios as we teach studio music private lessons and working with neurodivergent and autistic students, I think Dr. Erin is the person that we ought to be listening to here in Canada, at least. She's been researching this for a very long time, has a PhD from McGill University, and she's now an adjunct faculty member with University of Ottawa in the Music for Health Research Institute, led by Gilles Como, who we've had on the webinar a couple of years ago. And we welcome her today. And she also is the director of the Lotus Center, which she founded in Ottawa, which does outreach for students that need this kind of assistance or special care. So Erin, welcome. Thanks so much for taking the time to present to us today and share your valuable work with us. First of all, I just want to ask you, could you describe to everyone what it is you sort of do and what the Lotus Center is?
Sure. Yeah. And thanks very much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. The Lotus Center is a charitable organization based in Ottawa. And I started it I've been teaching piano for almost 30 years now. But in 2010, I was just starting my PhD at McGill. And at that same time, my son was diagnosed with autism. As a parent, my whole life became researching autism. But I had taught a number of neurodivergent students in the sort of 10, 12 years before that and really enjoyed that work. And at the same time, as a parent, I was really struggling to find, activities for my son where the teachers knew how to handle him and work with him effectively. So that's where Lotus Center came from, is really trying to be that place where neurodivergent students could come and parents could be confident that that was our expertise, that was our interest. We were never going to turn them away. And we did hear from a lot of parents that they had tried lessons with other teachers and been told that their child wasn't able to take music lessons or anything like that. So we work with all students with exceptionalities right across the spectrum, all ages, typically private music lessons. So a lot of piano lessons, but also in a variety of different instruments. We have about 145 students in private lessons that come every week. And we do a lot of outreach activities as well. So going into special education classrooms primarily. We have a partnership with the National Arts Center Orchestra where we go out with them. So we see about 1,000 students a year through our outreach as well. And we also have a professional development wing because I'm very passionate about that. That was my PhD. Research was in training studio piano teachers to work with students with autism. For me, that's the biggest sort of piece of the puzzle for accessibility because we can do as much as we can at Lotus Center, but the more teachers have the tools to work with these students, then it, is exponential, the increase in accessibility. And as Derek mentioned, I'm also a researcher working on best practices in adaptive music education, and also the impacts of music education on participating students. So if you're really interested in this topic, Lotus Center does have a professional development institute with lots of webinars, blog articles, resources, all kinds of things. And I'll share the website for that at the end. And I think with that, I can jump in. Is that okay? I'll share my screen.
Absolutely.
Okay, here we go. So I will get right into it. So we're going to talk about a positive approach to piano teaching for neurodiverse or neurodivergent students, and just some basics first of what we're going to cover. There are a whole lot of diagnoses or conditions that are neurodivergent. We think often about autism and ADHD, but there are so many. So in this particular webinar, I'm not going to talk about diagnoses so much. I'm not going to really talk about this is autism, this is ADHD. We're going to look at neurodivergent students as a whole. And so we're going to talk about support needs rather than diagnosis. And another reason for this is so often teachers say, well, I don't know if there's a diagnosis. I think there's something, but I don't really know. And that can be for a number of reasons. It could be that the parents aren't sharing for a number of reasons. It could be that there's not a diagnosis. It can also be that the student is experiencing some of these challenges, but they're not quite at the level that would be needed for a clinical diagnosis. But that doesn't mean they don't need support. And so, my approach is always to just give support where I see it's needed, whether I know there's a diagnosis or not. Diagnoses are really helpful because then we have a starting point. But, even with that, there will be different needs in different areas. So we're going to talk about how to support students that need that extra support in executive function, sensory needs, behavior, and anxiety, which is a big piece of the teaching experience for neurodivergent students. So this is the neurodivergent umbrella. So you can see there are a whole lot of conditions under this umbrella. Autism, ADHD are there, of course, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, all kinds of sensory processing disorders, gifted and twice exceptional being a gifted person that also has another exceptionality like autism or learning disabilities. So this is a huge spectrum, and there's way too much under here for me to cover. I could talk for days and days and days about teaching neurodivergent students, but this is partially why we're just going to talk according to support needs. And this is really just to make you aware that there is a lot under this umbrella. And so when we talk about teaching neurodivergent students, it's beyond ADHD and autism. And there are a lot of students that are going to come to us with different support needs. So some key concepts to consider. Most of the conditions that we talk about as neurodivergent are on a spectrum from mild to severe. Certainly, we talk about the autism spectrum disorder in that context. Today, we're not going to focus so much on the severe end, particularly with autism, where we're usually talking about students that are nonverbal. Very often, students that are on the severe end of the autism spectrum also have an intellectual disability. And that's a whole other series of approaches that needs to be taken there. I do teach a lot of students on the severe end of the autism spectrum, but we're just not going to cover that today because it's quite different. So we will be focusing more on students that, don't have really any serious cognitive issues, that just need some extra support, but are able to access sort of traditional or typical piano lessons. So, as I mentioned, look at the characteristics and the support needs. The diagnosis is really just a starting point if we have one, but it's really not necessary. I always teach with a strengths-based approach versus a deficit approach. And very often, there is a whole, field of research that looks at language and approaches to disability. And the medical model, we call it, is basically the diagnostic criteria, which is a series of deficits. And that's what it is you diagnose ADHD, for example, by the challenges that they have. That's all true. And it's good to know that because it can give us a snapshot of where there might be extra supports. Um, but we also need to really lean into strengths. So, for example, students with ADHD can be so creative, and so quick-witted and really pick things up quickly. Autistic students often have such strong oral abilities. The typical population of non-trained musicians, the incidence of perfect pitch or absolute pitch is about 1 in 10,000. And for autistic people, it's about 1 in 20. So there's this crazy, range of oral abilities. And so we lean into that, right? And there's the wonderful thing about music is there are so many ways to teach it in experience, right? It's primarily an oral art, but there are also visual aspects and lots of ways to incorporate visuals. Aside from just staff reading, there's all kinds of things we can do. It's also a kinesthetic art. We're using our bodies, we're moving. And so we can lean into all of those approaches. It's not at all to say if a student has really strong oral skills and we're leaning into that, that we don't do note reading. It's just the primary way that we're going to approach their learning. Be authentic in your teaching. Everything I'm going to say today is pretty general, but there are some very specific approaches that can be used. But really, it needs to feel like it's coming from you. So you'll hear some teachers that take a certain approach to classroom management, for example, or instructional control, and others have a totally different approach. Some teachers are very structured, and that works for some students. Some teachers are less so and go with the flow, and that's okay. You hear a lot about structure in teaching students with exceptionalities or neurodivergent students. Yes, that's important, but the way that you approach it, authenticity is very important. Your students will pick up on that. So everything that I'm saying or anything you ever read about teaching neurodivergent students is, recommendations that you can adapt to feel natural for yourself. And understand that the whole student needs to be considered and that learning potential is not only defined by the best case scenario. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you have a gifted student, either an intellectually gifted student or a musically gifted student that is capable of a lot, but they are dealing with anxiety and even severe anxiety, which we know can really, really impact learning. That's important too, right? So even though musically they might be capable a lot if they didn't have anxiety, they do. And that's going to impact what they're capable of. And so we need to take that into account. Everything that's going on with this student is going to impact what they're capable of in that moment. And we need to understand and respect who they are fully as a person and what their experience is at that point. And it's really important for neurodivergent students for a lot of the reasons that we're going to talk about. So we're going to start with executive function. This is an area of challenge for a lot of neurodivergent students. Pretty much every condition that falls under the neurodivergent umbrella has some aspect of executive function challenge. And so there are 8 elements in executive function. The executive function is really high level thinking. So it's taking everything in that is happening, that they're seeing, that they're experiencing, and then responding to it or deciding what to do with it. It's the highest level brain function that we have. And so it includes things like impulse control, emotional control, so being able to keep your feelings in check, flexible behavior and flexible thinking, so being able to adjust to changes or to adapt the way that you are thinking or approaching something based on new knowledge that's coming in. Working memory, keeping key information in mind while using it. This is a really important aspect of music performance because there are things like, key signatures, what dynamic your level that you're at. If there are things like a pedaling pattern that continues that you just see simile at the bottom and you're supposed to remember. These can be really, really challenging. And sometimes with students, at least for me, earlier on in my teaching, before I worked with a lot of neurodivergent students, I resisted doing things like writing in all the sharps or flats all the way through because I wanted them to learn how to remember the key signature. But for some of these students, their brain doesn't allow that very easily. And as much as we, want them to learn these things, and there's nothing wrong with encouraging them learning these things, we have to consider what is their brain capable of. And that's a good example of, it can be a very intelligent student that is capable of a lot, but this piece is just, not functioning at the same level as some other students that have the same level of intelligence. Self-monitoring is also really huge in piano performance or any kind of music performance. That is awareness of what you're doing and then adjustments. So for example, if your teacher asks you to, work on this phrasing, it's playing it and then being able to say, did I do it? And going back and saying, oh, not quite, let me work on that again. It's so crucial in music performance. And so that's why sometimes we get students that come to their lesson and we're like, did you practice? Like you didn't do any of the things that, you were supposed to do. Could be that they didn't practice, not to say that doesn't happen. But it could also very well be that they did. And so often our students are like, I did. And it's because they're going home and they are playing, but they're not able to monitor and say, did I do that? No, I didn't. Let me try it again and try it again and try it again. Planning and prioritizing, so being able to set and meet goals, which is also really important. Task initiation, so getting started, not procrastinating. And organization, keeping track of things both physically and mentally. So sometimes we see this with students that are forgetting their books or their sheet music or whatever we're asking them to bring, or they bring it and the sheets are like all crumpled up and just kind of like thrown in their bag. So, a big part of this is having some empathy and remembering that their brain's just not doing these things. And there's nothing we can do about that really as teachers, except to give them strategies and supports that can help them through this. So here are some strategies that you can use if you see that your student struggles with executive function. One is to practice practicing. And you may already be doing this, but just to be very mindful of it and very purposeful. So rather than, just writing in a notebook or however it is that you're communicating to your student what they need to practice when they go home, practice doing it with them. And so if you're going to write something like in measure 15, work on this crescendo or whatever it is, really work with them in the lesson, not just to show them what to do, but to make sure that they understand and to make sure that they are able to do that self-monitoring piece. So, doing things like playing it for them yourself and asking them to listen and making sure that they can identify the difference. A big piece of teaching neurodivergent students is always kind of getting to the root of what's happening. So it could be that they play it and you ask them, did you achieve what we're asking you to do? And they say, I don't know. Is the issue that they're not able to orally process it? Is it the self-monitoring piece? It could be a bunch of things. So that you have to do these things to kind of troubleshoot. So one of them is you play it yourself wrong first and then write and ask them if they can hear it. If they can, then it's self-monitoring. So you can work on that with them going through that process. It may not be perfect, but it's just going through it with them and it will improve over time. It's not that they can't learn these things eventually. It's a little bit delayed and they need extra help. Remove any items that may be distracting because attention and focus can be an issue. Baskets are my best friend. Like everything on my shelves is in baskets because we have a lot of things, right? A lot of little like supports that we use in our teaching or whatever. Just make sure that they're hidden away so that they're not just visual distractions for the student that's going to pull their focus. Support working memory by marking the score as needed. Anything that they need there. If they need all the pedaling or whatever written in, just do it. Changing activities often, or at least the way that you're doing them. And so I'm always very mindful of balancing my pedagogical goals with what the students need, because I don't think we ever should sacrifice our pedagogical goals. Or if we're, working towards something with the student and we can see that they're um, getting less focused or getting distracted, just abandoning what we were going to do. But I would instead change the way that you're doing things. So maybe if you're sitting at the piano working on a rhythm, and they're kind of getting antsy, just get up and work on it another way. Maybe, get on the floor and use some sort of kinesthetic supports or some rhythm cards or something like that. There's even things like you can use Lego to work on rhythms with the different sizes. And if you're interested in that, just, look it up online. That kind of thing can be really engaging for students, but you're still working on the rhythm using body percussion, that kind of thing. And then you can go back to the piano and work on it, but it's just to change that up, but you're still working on exactly what you wanted to work on. Be prepared to support emotional needs and frustration, remembering that emotional control piece. We all get frustrated, right? There's nothing wrong with getting frustrated. Every student we've ever had probably feels that at some point. The difference here is that it can bubble over. And sometimes this can be really challenging for teachers. And, we don't quite know how to deal with that, which is totally, fair. And we want to get on with the learning piece. Again, we have to understand this is a brain difference. It's not the student being, defiant or anything like that necessarily. Their brain is not helping them to calm down. So we need to be prepared to see that. And we'll talk when we talk more about behavior, but what that looks like and what we can do to support. And provide very clear guidelines for practice. And this may include visuals, like taking pictures of things that you want to do and send them on with them, or videos. Um, because there may be issues with memory as well, they might kind of lose what you were doing. If there's the self-monitoring piece and you did find they responded well when you did it and then they did it, videotape that and send it to them. And then they can kind of work with that in their lesson as well. So now let's talk about the sensory piece. This is a really, really big piece that I wasn't aware of enough until I started working with an occupational therapist on developing some approaches for neurodivergent students. And I was like, wow, it really is a big thing. And when I started to support my students with this element, it made a huge, huge, huge difference. So there are a lot of conditions that can include an element of sensory sort of dysfunction or difficulty processing the sensory world. So autism, for sure, this is a big one where we often know about that. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, ADHD, sensory processing disorder, just to name a few. And it's important to note that this can mean hyper or hyposensitivity. We often think of, especially autistic students, as being hypersensitive, meaning they need everything to be sort of lower stimulation because they get overstimulated. And that can certainly be true. But they can also be hyposensitive, where they need more stimulation. And this is a piece of ADHD too, where they can get overstimulated, but they're also seeking the stimulation. So it's important to remember that. And it's not necessarily uniform. So they can be hypersensitive in some and hyposensitive in others. So it's quite challenging, especially challenging if you teach group classes. That's a whole other thing that we won't get into today, but and just to be aware that there can be these real differences. And when we're talking about sensory needs, we're talking about 8 senses, not just 5. So everybody knows the main 5: touch, smell, taste, sight, and hearing. There's also the vestibular sense, which is movement. So if you see kids that are always like swinging on the bench or in their chair, which just totally freaks me out when I have kids doing that, or kids that, like to even get upside down, kids that love swings, that kind of thing. That means they're hyposensitive in their vestibular sense, so they're seeking more stimulation that way. Whereas if you're someone like me that just can't tolerate roller coasters or gets car sick or something like that, that's hypersensitivity in our vestibular sense. Proprioception is where we are in space. So a good way to understand proprioception is to practice, moving without using the visual input, because that can inform it, and sort of make it so that the proprioception isn't isolated. So to understand this, we can put our index fingers up and try to make them touch over your head without seeing them. So like mine went like this. I never quite get it right. My proprioception is not perfect. So if yours went like this, good for you. You've got really great proprioception. So this obviously is a really big part of music performance. So, especially if it's an instrument like a, string instrument, violin or something, where it's really like we're not even looking ahead, it's over here. So we're not seeing it. We have to just feel it. That you need to have fairly good proprioception for that. Piano is easier because it's all laid out in front of us. We can see it. But so often we tell our students, like, don't look at your fingers, look at your score, um, which, I mean, we have to look at the score to know what we're going to play. But often the students that are telling us, well, I have to look at my fingers, it could be because they have poor proprioception and they really do need to look at their fingers. Like they can't really sense which fingers are moving or what they're doing without the visual input. And so again, it's remembering that it's not just, you know, that they're not doing it because it's easier. It might be because they really do need to. And so we need to find ways to kind of support them in that. And then interoception is really less relevant. I just put it up there so I make sure that, we're covering all of it. Interoception is your internal sense. So like, I feel too hot, I feel hungry, that kind of thing. This is a really important piece of understanding the sensory, the way that our students are experiencing the sensory world. So the window of tolerance here, or sometimes it's called the zone of optimal arousal, is when we're getting the amount of stimulation that we need to really be learning well. So it's also like in the zone, right? So, we're feeling on top of things, we're thinking really clearly, like we're just like on top of it. A lot of our students struggle with staying in that window of tolerance. And there can be two pieces there. Everybody's window of tolerance is different, right? Some people, for example, work best when they're at like a busy cafe where there's like people talking around them and dishes sort of clinking and that kind of thing. And a lot of people seek that out. They go to a cafe to work. So they need more stimulation to be in their window of tolerance. If you're someone like me, like I work from home and it is silent, I don't have music on, it's quiet. And that's the only way I can really work. If there's too much going on, my brain starts to like get a little frazzled. So my window of tolerance is down here. And so, anybody's can be anywhere. And naturally, we're seeking out the stimulation that we need to stay there. So, like if we're getting bored, for example, we don't have a phone, or before we had phones, and you kind of like start to doodle or something. That's you trying to give yourself the stimulation you need to stay engaged and stay attentive. Whereas if you had just too much stimulation in a day and you go home and you're like, I just need a hot bath or whatever it is, you're trying to bring yourself back down into your window of tolerance. For a lot of our students, their nervous system doesn't do that for them very naturally. So if they start to get overstimulated or hyper aroused, their system's not very good at bringing them back down. The other piece is often their window is very narrow. So while most of us can tolerate, a fair amount, for a lot of our students, they really can't. So it can be a fair bit of work to keep them in there. And then the other piece to that is because a lot of our students struggle with emotional regulation, when they start to get hyper or hypo aroused, they just react. So most of us, if we get overstimulated or hyper aroused, we might feel like, if someone touches me, I'm going to lose it. Probably all of us have felt that at some time, but we don't lose it, right? We might feel that way, but we can like calm ourselves down and we understand this, so like that would be totally inappropriate. Some of our students cannot calm themselves down. So they will maybe throw things or they'll like shove their music book off of the piano or, tear a paper or whatever they're going to do because they feel the frustration or the overstimulation that a lot of us feel. There's nothing wrong with that. We've all experienced it, but their brain doesn't allow them to calm themselves down or tell themselves not to get over frustrated. At its worst, if it's like like really hyper aroused, it could be a meltdown. So when we talk about autistic people having a meltdown, that's what it is. They've gotten way too overstimulated. They have not been able to bring themselves down, and their brain essentially turns off. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Hypoarousal is not as explosive. It's just kind of like lethargy or being unmotivated. So that's where we need to like give a little more stimulation to bring our student up. Finding this balance can be challenging. So here are some strategies and adaptations that can help with this. if you know that your student, you can see that there's this sort of push and pull in the lessons, like maybe when your student is at the piano for too long, they start to fidget or they start to like play around or even like bang on the keys, especially younger kids. That's them telling you that their nervous system is like, more, 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 more. I need more stimulation. So there's nothing wrong with that. That's what their nervous system is telling them they need. So give it to them in other ways because we want them in that window of tolerance, that optimal zone. That's where they're going to learn best. But we want to help them do it in proactive, productive ways that are supporting our pedagogical goals. So, again, maybe get away from the piano and do something physical or like along with like a heavy beat or something like that. Or find something you can do at the instrument that is like using a lot of the body and giving a lot of sound and depending on the sensory input that you see your student responds to. You could also make sure that you have a variety of calming and stimulating activities sort of in your toolkit. So, one piece is planning your lesson that way. Like, okay, I see that at the halfway point, my student really starts to like need more. I'm just going to plan something at that point that gives it to them. But you never know what the day is going to bring. So it's good to just have these sort of in your back pocket that as soon as you see your student do this, you have a different way to adapt the activity that you had planned to give them what they need there. Things will just go so much more smoothly if you kind of have those things available. You can use movement in grounding ways too. Sometimes I see students have like a body break at school or something, and they're like jumping on a trampoline or something. And it's like, whoa, that's like, that can be so overstimulating so quickly. Doing things instead, like, you know, bending your legs and kind of bouncing, not jumping. So doing that to rhythm or even on the ground on your knees, kind of bouncing that uses your large muscles without like leaving the ground is really good. It's giving the input that we need without like hyping up. And again, one great thing about music is we can use movement so easily to support the learning that we're doing. Be very aware of which senses are required in each activity. And you can use this awareness to create or reduce sensory input. So if you know that your student is hypersensitive to auditory input, don't, for example, use a backing track with a heavy beat. That could just be a lot for them. Just remove that piece. You can also have aids like wiggle seats, which is in the photo here, which is just like, it's filled with air and it gives that stimulation. You may not want them to use it while they're playing, depending on how they're using it, but maybe if you're going over to a desk to do some theory work or something like that after either a wiggle seat or an exercise ball. I feel like exercise balls you can be asking for trouble, maybe depending on the student. If you have any kind of ball in your studio, wiggle seats are pretty safe. So they work really well to just like really what you want to do is give that sensory input um, in a way that allows your student to stay focused on what you want them to do. So they're not seeking it out in ways that are pulling them away from what you want them to do. So now let's talk a little bit about behavioral support needs, because as you can see with the things that we've already talked about, the executive function with sensory needs, it can lead to some behavioral challenges and research, as well as my own experience in working with hundreds of teachers that work with neurodivergent students, is that this is the most challenging piece for a lot of teachers. And so here too, there are a lot of conditions that can be impacted, including anxiety, which is not always on everybody's radar. So we'll talk about that a little bit more too. What I really want to emphasize here again is it's a brain difference. Not to say that there aren't environmental factors But it is fundamentally a brain system. Um, Students want to do well. Kids want to do well. They don't want to typically be difficult just to be difficult. And even when we see diagnoses like oppositional defiant disorder, um, which I really dislike that label, but it is marked by oppositional defiant behavior. There's a brain-based reason for it. We know this through research. And so it's important just to understand a little bit of what's happening. So the amygdala and the brainstem controls fight or flight. It's really basic. The midbrain includes the limbic system. So this is feeling, emotions. So when this part gets dysregulated, that's where we can see some sort of acting out behaviors. And the prefrontal cortex is where the executive function lies, basically. It's the highest function of the brain. And so one really, really helpful model that I've seen in understanding this, behavioral challenge is the hand model of the brain, where we talk about the wrist being like the brain, the hindbrain, the brainstem and the amygdala. The thumb is the limbic system, and the fingers as the forebrain or the prefrontal cortex. So if all is going well, the limbic system, the thumb is tucked in, and the forebrain is covering it up, and everything is like supporting each other as it should. The executive function, the forebrain is able to kind of take over and control the limbic system, keep it calm, and the brainstem and the amygdala are calm. If the limbic system is sort of being triggered, there's like flashing lights in the brain, then the forebrain, the prefrontal cortex, pops up, and we call that in this hand model flipping your lid. And so the forebrain is not working anymore. And executive function is out the window. This limbic system has the control. So it's very difficult at that point to try to tell the student to have emotional control or all of these things. That's here. It's gone. It's not working right now. Even worse is when the limbic system also opens up and we're left with just the amygdala and the brainstem, which is fight or flight. And again, that's where we can really see like a meltdown. So unless you're working with a student with quite severe behaviors, which I do, but that's really all, I only have neurodivergent students now, you hopefully won't see a lot of that fight or flight, but we do see a lot of flipped lids and focus on the limbic system. So this is where we can see a lot of behaviors when the student isn't able to reason. And for some kids, it's like 50-50 whether this is down or up. And so we can see a lot of challenging behaviors. But it is, I always show this part so we can remember that it is, again, a brain thing. It's not necessarily chosen behavior. Again, not to say that there's maybe not issues with discipline or structure in other parts of their lives, but this is always at the core of that. And it's really well established in the research that that's the case. Another important piece here is anxiety. It's so prevalent in neurodivergent students. Depending on the neurodivergence, it can be like 85%, like for ADHD, for example, that also experience disordered anxiety, like not just functional anxiety, like, if you're going to perform in a concert, like, performance anxiety is normal. You're about to do something where people are going to watch you, totally normal. Doesn't feel good, but it's normal. We're talking here about disordered anxiety, where it really is disrupting function. So we all have an idea of what anxiety is. Probably a whole lot of us have some disordered anxiety as well, or have had in our life. But in a child, often it shows up very differently than it does in adults. So it can show up a lot of the time as anger. And it's because basically disordered anxiety is perceiving threats when they aren't really there, or um, reacting to things that are there in more than is required to meet the stress of that moment. In kids, especially that have difficulty with executive function and have difficulty with emotional regulation, they will react to this stress more than an adult who has more control over this. So they can get angry and they can act out. There can also be difficulty sleeping, which we're not going to see so much in the lesson. But if you've ever not slept well or had insomnia, you know that it disrupts the way you're functioning, for the whole next day or however long you're experiencing that real fatigue. Defiance. So it says, unable to communicate what is really going on, it's easy to interpret the child's defiance as a lack of discipline instead of an attempt to control a situation where they feel anxious and helpless. So we see that quite a lot when we're teaching a student with anxiety. Chandeliering is when there's like a sudden reaction, um, when it seems like not much has happened. But it's usually because there's just such a state of anxiety. There's just such a quick reaction to any stress because they're primed to react that way. A lack of focus. So students with anxiety are often just so caught up in other things that they're not able to focus. Avoidance, task avoidance. Sometimes what we're asking our students to do is challenging, right? Or even just it's not fun and they're not it's difficult for them to face it. So avoidance can be a big thing. And this can also be a part of why sometimes we have students come to us and say they didn't practice, is this they have anxiety about it. Negativity. Sometimes we see this come out as perfectionism in our students. So, things like when they make a mistake and they have to go back to the beginning and they have to play it through until it's perfect. They can't accept their mistakes. And it's also a control thing. They need to know that they can do it the way that they think it should be done. And over planning. So really trying to, again, control what's happening, so that they don't have to be anxious about not knowing what might happen. So some strategies and adaptation for behavior and anxiety. It's really important to see behavior as communication of what the student is experiencing at that moment. I always think of it as trying to see my student in distress rather than causing distress. It's not at all to minimize the distress that we may feel when our student is exhibiting some challenging behaviors. It's more to try to engender some empathy there so that we're responding in a way that they will respond to. Because if we respond with stress, it's just gonna like build and build and build. So if we can really focus on, okay, what are they communicating to me about their experience right now? Are they feeling anxious? Am I asking them to do something that is too challenging for them in the moment? And then again, this goes back to considering the whole child. Are they capable intellectually, physically, in terms of their musical development? Yeah, maybe. Maybe they're totally capable, but right now their anxiety is not allowing them to do it, and that's valid. So what can we do to work on that with them? So responding to the behavior, and communicating in a way that doesn't reinforce it. So if they are, avoiding a task and exhibiting task avoidance behaviors, it's not to say that you then abandon it and say, okay, they're too anxious about this. Find a way to that they still need to engage with what you're asking them, but maybe you're reducing your ask at that time to support them. So if you were going to send them home to practice a whole piece, and that's obviously too much for them, you can reduce what you're asking or reduce in that moment. Like if you're really like, I want to work through this whole piece and work on the articulation, and they're avoiding doing that because it seems overwhelming, say, let's work just on, even the first bar or whatever it may be, right? So they're not avoiding it completely, and you don't want to show them that they can have behaviors to avoid tasks and that's going to work for them because you don't want that on an ongoing basis. Have environmental and curricular adaptations that can help you to reduce behaviors. So staying in the optimal zone. A lot of the things we've talked about it before. Building trust and rapport with your student so that they feel safe and at ease with you. I cannot stress the importance of this enough. Take some time to connect with your student, doing things even like making sure that your facial expression is really open and happy and just seeming like you want to be there with them when they maybe have challenging moments, making it clear that you're in it with them. It's not changing how you feel about them. You might not be tolerating the behaviors that they're, exhibiting at that moment, but you'll move on. You'll move on and you'll have fun together. And provide opportunities for them to have agency in their lesson. A lot of kids that are neurodivergent need this for a wide variety of reasons. Um, and sometimes it's just a task preference thing. Like some things are more fun than others. None of us want to do tons of technique, right? Like that's just normal. For some of our students, they have a harder time getting over that hump. And again, it's not to say that we're like, okay, I guess you don't do technique anymore. I mean, that's not what we want. Um, but maybe give some options for how they can engage with that you're still learning what they want to learn, and allowing them to choose that a little bit, especially for students that have anxiety. Let them make some decisions. Give them a couple of options for things that, again, still support your pedagogical goals for them, but allow them to also feel like they have some control. And that will also just allow things to go more smoothly because they are going to engage more with things that they are choosing. So that's it for my presentation. Happy to take questions. Here's the website for our Lotus Institute for Professional Development. And again, there's webinars. There's also a certification course, which is like a 10-week intensive course if you really want to dive deep into this material. So I will stop my share now. There we go.
Okay, thanks, Erin. That's really, really helpful. All sorts of really great ideas to introduce us to this concept of working with neurodivergent students. If anyone has any questions, please throw them in the Q&A, or you can also raise your hand, use the raise your hand feature. We can bring you on if the question's too difficult to type. A couple of things I like there. You mentioned at the beginning the idea about parents and maybe they're not sharing a potential diagnosis or that they're in a process to get that. What are some of the reasons do you think that parents don't share with us that diagnosis?
It can be a number of things, and I'm saying this also as a parent, though I did usually choose to share the diagnosis, but sometimes parents have shared this diagnosis and immediately people have kind of gotten their back up. And particularly with teachers that are then right away from the get-go seeing this student as a challenge. And so sometimes parents don't want to set that up for their child. They don't, you know, they want to give their child the best chance to just be approached as a typical child and not as a challenge. At Lotus Center, we don't see that because they're coming because they know we'll adapt. So it's great for the teacher to put that out. Like if you have an intake form or something, even if you put on there, does your child have any neurodivergence or condition that needs extra support? And they can put that, and so they know you're open to it. It could be also that their child doesn't want it. Sometimes the child is not comfortable with it. And so, that's valid too. So sometimes I've seen teachers, like, especially on like discussion boards and stuff, a little frustrated with that. But again, I think some empathy is important that there might be really valid reasons that parents or, students themselves are choosing not to share.
Yeah. And we see a couple of questions here. Carrie, first, I see a couple of hands up. Carrie, did you raise your hand on purpose? I'm going to allow you to talk. And you are off mute now. If you want to unmute yourself, Carrie, you can ask the question. Go ahead.
Sure, I'll ask it instead of type it. It'll go faster. Thank you very much. I have 4 neurodivergent students. 3 are in a group class. 1 is an older student and she comes privately. 2 of them I absolutely love. I look forward to them. They're joyful people. They're not easy to teach. They're definitely mid-spectrum, if I could give my own assessment. But they're kind and they're sponges, and they come and they just say, hi, I love you. I love this. Can we do more? Give me more. And sometimes the challenge is just keeping them focused. I have one that comes in with two actually that come in with a sour face, a negative attitude. They can be quite off-putting with their words. The one is forced to come, the other comes, she's older, she's 15. And I find it so difficult to get myself ready for them. Do you have any suggestions? I try really hard not to come back with a nasty comment. I mean, I hope I never have. I don't think I have. But they will slap my hand away. If I say something, they will correct me. No, you're wrong. That's not the way it is. Even though it's clearly, I mean, I know what the note is. They'll argue about the note name just to be right. Do you have any strategies for that? I can't send them away. There aren't any other teachers. I'm a rural teacher. It would break my heart to disappoint the family.
Yeah, well, I really thank you for sticking with them, because you're right, it is really important that they have that opportunity to learn. I totally understand what you're saying because, I'm saying all of this as if it's like, just do this or just do that. I totally get that it's challenging. And even at Lotus Center, we have students that are extra challenging and some teachers that do struggle, with that. And it is hard when we have students that are reacting very negatively to us and just putting out negative energy to not like return that, right? Um, I think the first part for me is always remembering those parts of themselves that we can't change, that they maybe don't like either. So things like, I have a lot of students that do the same thing that you're saying, that I point something out to them and they're like, no, you're wrong. I'm like, who do you think you're talking to? Like, I know what I'm talking about. But it's that inflexible thinking, right? They think it's a certain way, which, I mean, a lot of our students are wrong, right? We're correcting them. That's like what we're here for. But it's really hard for them to take in that new information and be like, oh, yeah, I'm wrong. Okay, let me fix it. And they also don't have the filter of like, let me say this in a polite way. Um, which is unfortunate and difficult to deal with. But that's what's happening there. That's not so much a strategy, but just to help us to like understand. And I know for me, when I started to learn all of this, it helped me a lot to understand that that's just the way they're going to be. Um, One of the sort of rapport building tools that I've learned, and it comes more from like attachment theory, is an acronym called PACE. And it's playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. And for me, the playfulness piece is really important in diffusing that and creating a relationship where they can become more playful too. And it takes some time. But even things like the way I just expressed it, right? Where I'm like, who do you think you're talking to? Like, but it's not, it's in kind of a fun way, right? Like, it's, yeah, I could say like, who do you think you're talking to? I'm the teacher. It's the same thing. I'm saying the same thing. And I mean it. Like, who do you think you're talking to? But I say it in a more playful way. Um, and they may still be a little bit difficult. But having that sort of playful energy over time, I'm telling you, like, I guarantee you it will start to diffuse that a little bit. I think the hardest thing is for us to let go of like you say, like our urge to push back, which is totally natural. I think it's really keeping in mind, I don't want this to happen anymore. I don't like how it feels for me. It's not helping me. It's making this harder. Maybe if I'm able to like just force myself to take this approach instead, it will help. I do find that's the thing that really, really helps, is trying to find that playfulness.
Playfulness, acceptance, compassion.
Cur well, I've
Oh,
seen it as
curiosity.
compassion actually, but it's curiosity about like what's going on with them right now, and empathy.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm going to bring Marcia on next. I know Marcia has worked a lot with neurodivergent students. Marcia, go ahead there. You can just unmute.
I was back to the parents disclosing things about their kids. When I'm registering or meeting a student for the first time, I always ask if they have allergies, and then I ask if there's something else that would help me teach their child better. And sometimes people will say, and sometimes people won't until after the first couple of times, and then they'll say, well, so and so's feeling okay. I recognize that there's a strong need for a feeling of safety.
Mhm.
And so if you can provide that, then with both the student and with the parent, then I find that things are much more comfortable. It doesn't mean that it works for you at every moment during the lesson, but so just by just asking as a matter of course, anything else, then I find that that's helpful. That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And you're exactly right. And that's actually where the pace comes from, is from that, like, just building rapport. And it's actually where it really came from, was in working with students or children with attachment disorders, and especially adopted children. And I'm an adoptive parent and was a foster parent. So that's actually where I came across it. And then I found, oh, it's used a lot in education, actually. But it is about creating that safety, and part of that hyper arousal and anxiety and that over responsiveness is from a sort of chronic feeling of lack of safety. And so if we can create that feeling, it kind of brings it all down. And like you say, it's not to say that there's not still issues, but it becomes much more manageable. But even more importantly, our student just feels better being with us,
And,
right?
and I think it's a matter of respect.
Mhm.
For the parents and for the kids, and while you might feel it, you might not consciously demonstrate it, so that I find helps too.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Marcia, for sharing that. And I'm going to go on to a question here from Ken now. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and experience. What kind of steps can you recommend for seeking a proper diagnosis? I know this is a rather broad question, but what kinds of challenges present when seeking diagnosis as a parent for their adolescent that we could offer support to our student and family community?
Yeah, this is really tricky. And I mean, I'm saying this as a parent too, that the best way to seek a diagnosis is to go through like a private provider that you know is an expert in this field. Um, but that's expensive, right? And it's very hard. There are clinics, depending on where you're located, that, can help you seek that out, but it's really difficult to access those sometimes, and there are long wait times. It's becoming more and more common to start with self-diagnosis, which is iffy. You're not a professional if you're doing a self-diagnosis. But as a starting point, while you wait to get into where you can get a professional diagnosis, just so you can start to self-advocate if it's you or if it's a teen, or as a parent, advocate and start to get these supports. It's especially common in adults that are realizing they struggled for years and they want to understand themselves. And I think it's really important for teens as well, start to learn to self-advocate. So often that's a good first step, is a self-diagnosis. There's lots of sort of information out there, just making sure there's a reputable one. And then, yeah, going to a clinic that specializes in that, or a private provider that is really expert in that as well.
Very good. So I'm seeing a bunch of things in the chat box here that we can refer to in a moment. I'm not seeing any other questions here in the Q&A. Thanks everyone for putting those in. And because we're just past the top of the hour, I think what we're going to do here is we're going to stop the YouTube live stream. If anyone needs to know, the recording is automatically available on the Conservatory Canada TV YouTube channel. It'll be there in a few minutes. As soon as I push the stop button, it pretty much loads. And so you can watch the replay there anytime. And in fact, replays from any of the past webinars. And then those of you that are in the Zoom room with, there's still a bunch of you left here. If you have any other questions, we'll keep going here with Erin for a little bit of time in case you have any other questions, and we'll work through a couple of things in the chat box. So everyone that's watching after the fact, thanks for joining us today.